Australia's most powerful regulators say higher interest rates aren't causing widespread financial distress. The value of lithium stocks surpasses the value of gold stocks for the first time. And Lennon and McCartney are back together thanks to AI. It's Thursday, the 15th of June, 2023. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, after the show, you have an interview, a cracking interview for investors. You're speaking to Dermot Ryan, portfolio manager at Renaissance Smaller Companies Fund.
Yeah, all about investing in small caps. As Dermot points out, the small cap index has underperformed the main index and certainly the large cap index quite substantially. So Dermot thinks maybe it's time to have a bit of a sniff around some of these small cap companies. He throws a few names at us that he's interested in for sure. Well worth a listen, particularly if you're an investor.
Yeah, it certainly is. It is a cracker. It's coming up a little bit later on. The main story this morning, though, Sean, the Council of Financial Regulators, which sounds very ominous, really, doesn't it?
It does.
Has backed the banking watchdog's enforcement of a 3% serviceability buffer when assessing home loan applicants.
Yes, that's despite borrowers finding it increasingly difficult to refinance their mortgages with different lenders at higher interest rates. Now, the serviceability buffer is all important. It's the amount extra that a borrower needs to be able to afford above the rate being charged when it gets the home loan. It's a security measure. The problem is that many mortgage holders have rolled off fixed rate loans onto much higher variable rates. What do? They go and see what else is out there. Sensible decision to do that. The problem is the buffer prevents them from switching loans to get a better deal because they can't afford that extra 3%. So the argument is it is much too high. It should only be 1 or 2%. The council, however, which is made up of the Reserve Bank, Treasury, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, and the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, which is the banking watchdog we mentioned, said households are experiencing significant pressure on their finances as they grapple with increased interest rates and inflation. However, they think the 3% should remain. Their argument, which is fair enough, is that you actually have to put that buffer in. So if rates go much higher, people are still able to afford home loans.
That is a very high-powered council. And they also said that the 12 rate rises since early May last year hadn't triggered widespread financial distress.
That's right. And that comment provides support somewhat for the Reserve Bank to keep lifting rates if it feels it's necessary. Today's labour force figures will give some guide on that particular issue. The council, which is chaired by Reserve Bank Governor Phil Lowe, found that the cost of living crunch, higher mortgage bills and climbing rents has left some households suffering significant pressures on their finances. But it also said most households are well placed to manage the impact on budgets due to strong labour market conditions and sizable saving buffers. Put all that together in the Mixmaster, Michael, in the Mixmaster.
You do love your bizarre cooking analogies.
I love my Mixmaster. Where you do end up with this, we hear plenty about higher rates and cost of living pressure, and certainly it's a big political issue. But the regulators are saying, yep, it is an issue, but we're not seeing a lot of distress out there yet. So they're perhaps a little calmer about it than the politicians are.
I just love the Council of Financial Regulators. It sounds so cool. When I picture that, I picture the meeting in a very dark room, all wearing kind of cloaks and things. Yeah. And maybe Yoda is there.
Oh, yeah. Led by Yoda Lowe.
Do you reckon Phil Lowe has ever been called Yoda Lowe before?
He's very thin, man. Maybe.
Yoda Lowe sounds like someone who would come from Switzerland.
Well, that's got a sound of music sort of feel to it, hasn't it, Yoda Lowe?
It certainly does. Goodness me, you've taken us to a strange place, Sean. Local markets, how did they perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed up 0.3% to 7,000. Yoda Lowe. That's got me going. Anyway, the market was up 0.3% to 7,162 points. Good day for lithium stocks, not so much the healthcare sector, particularly CSL. More on that shortly. Materials stocks were easily the best performers, while financials also did well. The healthcare sector tanked, while tech stocks had a rough day. Now, mostly it was about China's decision to cut some interest rates on Tuesday. in expectations of a further stimulus in the world's second largest economy that helped push up the price of iron ore, which is a big ingredient for steel, of course. As a result, BHP's share price jumped 3.6%, Fortescue Metals was up 4.3%, and Rio Tinto rose 2.9%. Otherwise, Macquarie Group, Westpac, National Australia Bank and Woodside all rose more than 1%. On the flip side, WiseTech Global and Xero were off around 2%, and Aristocrat Leisure was down 1.5%.
And what about international markets?
I mentioned iron ore prices are higher. Otherwise, not a lot of movement in commodities. The big news overnight, of course, was that the US Federal Reserve did not lift interest rates, kept them on pause as was expected. That's helped markets, and certainly the Aussie dollar too. It was not quite at 70 cents, but it's sort of heading in that direction.
All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, as you mentioned earlier, CSL's share price tumbled 7% yesterday after the Blood Plasma Group said earnings hadn't met expectations with weak margins in its blood collection centres.
The third largest company on the ASX also operates a drugs division, and yesterday flagged the impact of generic drugs competing against its iron deficiency drug. While earnings this financial year will come in at the top end of guidance, it's the forecast for next year that sent the share price lower. Profit margins at blood collection centres have been hurt by COVID. People were more reluctant to give blood. That meant CSL had to up incentives. Normally that's payments to donors. That's still hurting. The bad news is that given competition in the market, CSL still has to pay those incentives, those higher fees, hence profit margins are being squeezed. Its share price of around $287 a share is now about the same as it was immediately before the COVID outbreak.
7%, that is a big drop. So investors would have really taken a bath on that one, a bloodbath, if you will.
Oh, I was going to make a serious comment about it because CSL always upgrade, they never downgrade. They've got a new CEO, it's his first time, and he comes and downgrades. And you have just, trivialised it.
I have, and it was quite a lengthy setup for it as well.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
Sean, we move on to quite a serious story here. Federal Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe has, in Parliament, accused Victorian Liberal Senator David Van of, quote, harassing and, again, quote, sexually assaulting her. Then, hours later, she withdrew the allegation.
The allegations were made by Thorpe soon after question time yesterday as Van made a speech accusing the Labor Party of disgraceful behaviour in its handling of the Brittany Higgins sexual assault allegations. As Van spoke, Thorpe could be heard interjecting and calling out the word perpetrator, and then again, I quote, "You can talk." Senate Deputy President Andrew McLaughlin attempted to stop Thorpe from interjecting, according to the Sydney Morning Herald. Then the former Green senator rose on a point of order and said, quote, "I'm feeling really uncomfortable when a perpetrator is speaking about violence," end quote. McLaughlin replied, quote, "That's inappropriate and I have to ask you to withdraw that." Then Thorpe responded, and again, I quote, because it's important that we get this exact, "I can't because this person harassed me, sexually assaulted me." She went on, and to have him talking about this today is an absolute disgrace on the whole party. As Thorpe sat down, McLaughlin said he'd have to refer her comments to the Senate President, Sue Lines. Van then rose to his feet and said, and I quote, "I utterly reject that statement, that disgusting statement outright. It is just a lie and I reject it." Hours later, after Van's lawyers had been in touch with Thorpe, she withdrew the comments and said she'd have more to say on it today.
Yeah, very serious story there out of Canberra, Sean. Now, I mentioned this one at the top of the show. The value of ASX-listed critical minerals companies has surpassed the value of gold stocks for the first time, demonstrating the weight of money going into green transition companies.
As of Tuesday night's close, the value of major ASX-listed critical minerals companies was $86.2 billion. That's up $8.6 billion in the past decade. According to the Financial Review, the basket of the 25 companies that comprise the S&P ASX All Ordinaries Gold Index was $86.1 billion, 0.1 billion less. Companies that mine minerals such as lithium, rare earths, graphite and nickel have gained favour over the past decade, and particularly in recent years as governments declare them critical to decarbonisation efforts and national security. There are now 88 lithium producers or explorers on the ASX. That's about 4% of the total number of companies on the bourse. Australian miners are now the world's biggest producer of raw lithium and one of the biggest producers of rare earths outside China.
Sean, senior executives at some of Australia's largest listed companies pocketed average pay rises more than double the rate of inflation over the past year.
The base salaries of managing directors across ASX-listed company rose an average of 14%, while CEO salaries rose an average of 15%, according to the latest board and executive remuneration report released by the Governance Institute of Australia. Chief Executive of the Institute, Megan Motto, said with AGM season looming, boards will need to have a strong narrative around their remuneration policies to stand up to shareholder scrutiny and manage reputation risks. The report also highlights that 42% of ASX-listed board directors and 71% of senior executives received a pay rise in the last 12 months. And just before we leave the subject of pay, the Reserve Bank yesterday came out and said it had underpaid 1,173 current and former staff during the past 7 years. It's pretty much the most prestigious organisation yet to be involved in the underpayment of workers. Of course, there are many companies involved in that.
Well, absolutely. And they would everyone would be looking at this and going, if it could happen to them, it could happen to any of us.
Exactly right.
Now, Sean, IAG is lifting Australian home insurance prices by 20% and car premiums by 14%, putting even more pressure on households.
Yep. The price rises prompted IAG Chief Executive Nick Hawkins to say he had never in his career seen the whole industry push through such hefty increases across a range of insurance products. Increasing cost pressures are behind the rise, he said. IAG, one of Australia's two biggest home and car insurers with brands including NRMA and CGU, is not price gouging customers, Hawkins said. Instead, it's trying to get a reasonable return, taking into account the material input cost changes that IAG and the industry have had to put up with over the past 12 to 24 months. IAG's share price closed up 2.6% yesterday.
Maggie Beer, the gourmet food producer, is looking to quadruple sales within 5 years. That's a fairly lofty goal, isn't it? In part by pushing into pasta products and non-food, lifestyle, entertaining and gardening products.
The company ain't big, but it is often in the news. It's had a rough 2023 with its share price down more than 30% following weaker earnings on the back of higher supply chain costs and problems at its Paris Creek Farms dairy and yogurt business. Also, it bought online hampers business, Hampers and Gifts, during the pandemic. That business has suffered in recent quarters. It's got a new chief executive, Kinda Grange. She talked up the company yesterday, saying she wants to boost revenue to $300 million within 5 years. She'll push the company into pasta and sugo ranges and also add to its ice cream offerings. In non-food, the company will expand its range of baking and cooking products under the Maggie Living banner that currently includes wooden spoons and rolling pins, Michael. I love that. Also, it's going to expand into gardening tools and table setting products, which, of course, begs the question, what is a table setting product? Is it a product that you use to set the table? Or is it just something that makes the table look good when it's set?
Well, I automatically assumed it was cutlery.
Oh, is that all?
Well, I don't know. I'm just intrigued about the gardening tools expansion. I just find that fascinating. Out of everything they could expand into, that they go into gardening tools.
Do you know something about the wooden spoon, which I think is totally fascinating? It is one of the few products that has never improved over, thousands of years. So thousands of years before us, people were using wooden spoons, and we're still using wooden spoons because it just doesn't transfer heat.
You know what? I reject that entirely. What about really? Silicon spatulas and things? They are futuristic, and you use those for stirring, and it's so much better because it doesn't absorb any of the flavour or any of the staining if you're doing a pasta product.
I'm not absolutely. You may be 100% correct. No problems there. But the wooden spoon is something that was used 1,000 years ago and is still used today. I don't think the silicon products were used 1,000 years ago.
No, they weren't.
No.
And I say that the wooden spoon should no longer be used. I'm calling for full boycott.
Oh, wow.
God, that got out of hand quickly, didn't it?
Last story, last local story, Michael.
Last one. Qantas. It's an airline story, Sean. I love airline stories. Qantas has launched direct flights from Auckland to New York.
The first flight departed yesterday, and Qantas Chief Executive Alan Joyce said that travellers would like the longer flight because it's less painful. Instead of transiting in Los Angeles, passengers can now fly through Auckland and then on to New York. Qantas will boost the number of flights each week to 4 from the current 3 to meet what Mr. Joyce described as very strong demand. Now, a direct Melbourne and Sydney to New York flight is scheduled for 2025 when the next generation Airbus A350-1000 planes arrived. Of course, we've done that story before. Qantas expects it will earn about $400 million in extra revenue, with travellers expected to pay a fair premium to take those flights. More of the cabins will be dedicated to business first and premium economy seats.
All right, on to international news now. Sean, Russia has unveiled a windfall tax on big companies to raise an estimated 300 billion rubles or 8 billion Australian dollars from its oligarchs as the war in Ukraine continues to really stretch the Kremlin's finances.
The proposed levy will require Russian groups making profits of more than 1 billion rubles a year since 2021 to pay a one-off tax worth up to 10% of the gains, according to a report in the Financial Times. Could you imagine that happening in Australia or the US? One senior cabinet official claimed the idea for the levy had come from the companies themselves, who realised they had made, I quote, gigantic, end quote, profits during the period that needed to be properly taxed. It's one of a series of measures to bolster the Kremlin's coffers after falling oil revenues under Western sanctions and a surge in war-related defence spending led to Russia running up a 3.4 trillion ruble budget deficit in the first half of this year.
Sean, Donald Trump yesterday morning pleaded not guilty to federal criminal charges that he unlawfully kept national security documents and lied to officials who sought to recover them.
I know we should ignore this story, but we can't. Trump called the charges the most evil and heinous abuse of power in America's history. He went on to say that President Joe Biden had engaged in political persecution like something straight out of a fascist or communist nation. And Department of Justice Special Counsel Jack Smith, who brought the case against Mr. Trump, he called him deranged. Mr. Trump, who, if convicted, can still campaign to be president and wouldn't be barred from taking office, is beating his closest Republican rival by 30 percentage points in the polls. He's also holding a winning margin over Biden, 45.5% to 43.7%.
All right, one last one. Sean mentioned this one at the top of the show. This is pretty extraordinary. More than 50 years after the Beatles broke up, founding member Paul McCartney says artificial intelligence has helped create one last Beatles song that will be released later this year.
The song was made using a demo tape with John Lennon's voice, McCartney said in an interview with BBC Radio 4. Using artificial intelligence, producers could take Lennon's voice and, quote, get it pure, as McCartney put it, and then mix the song. Of course, Lennon was killed outside his Manhattan apartment building in December 1980. His widow, Yoko Ono, sometime afterwards, gave the demo tape to McCartney. 2 other songs in that tape, Free as a Bird and Real Love, were later completed by the 3 surviving Beatles, or 3 surviving at that time, and they were released in 1995, 1996. Now there's going to be one last Beatles song. Incredible.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Dermot Ryan, Portfolio Manager at Renaissance Smaller Companies Fund.
All about small caps and the fact that they have been hammered in recent times, but Dermot thinks might be time to have a look at them again, and he gives us a few suggestions about the ones he likes. Great chat.
Yeah, we're not an investing podcast, but it's well worth a listen. You should get professional advice before making any investment decisions. And also, while you're at it, have a listen to the new episode of How Do They Afford That, which came out yesterday. This week's episode is all about car loans and car leases and basically how to make those kinds of things work for you. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Thursday, the 15th of June, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.